Greetings, hola, bon dia, buenos dias. My name is Lorelei Williams, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Grants at Comic Relief US, and particularly with oversight of our Red Nose Day grant-making program. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this timely and important conversation, the intersection of race for children in the Americas. The intersection of race and poverty for children in the Americas. We have a phenomenal panel lined up today led by the brilliant Zakiya Carr-Johnson, so I won't spend too much time with an introduction, but I did want to share a little bit briefly about Comic Relief US and the work we do and why this panel discussion today is so important for this work in this context. Comic Relief harnesses the power of entertainment and public mobilization, public education, to bring positive change. We partner with a number of corporations like Walgreens, Mars, and NBC, as well as other public funders and institutions to harness the power of entertainment and to mobilize people to address poverty around the world in service of our vision of a just world free from poverty. And Red Nose Day is probably the way that many of you know us. Red Nose Day is a special day where everyone around the United States wears a little red nose, and that galvanizes people to really understand and tune into the issues of child poverty and to raise millions of dollars for very important partners, many of whom are joining us on this call today, whose work is really critical around ensuring young people, children around the globe and around the US are safe, healthy, and educated and empowered so that they can have better opportunities to thrive and lead. I want to give some brief context on this panel and why I'm particularly thrilled to offer it today as part of our grantee convening. We understood back in the 2019 strategic planning sessions that I led as we charted out our next 5 years as a funder, that you can't talk about poverty without talking about race and structural racism, right? And so we also knew that we needed a deeper cross-portfolio focus around racial equity and around gender equity. And so that informs our work in education, in safety, in economic empowerment, youth leadership development, and in health, because we understand that you have to have an intersectional lens. None of these things operates in isolation. Another important goal for us around this conversation, it's in alignment with our goal to triple our investment in Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations, both in the US, and then also organizations who are led by the populations that they serve globally. And we also, in that 2019 strategic planning session, articulated a deeper desire and recognition of the importance of a focus on Latin America and looking at the intersections of race and gender there, gendered violence, and also looking at the issues of migrant and refugee children. We have a particular focus that we've articulated around Mexico, Colombia, also the Northern Triangle in Central America, Haiti, and Brazil. And so we understand, again, the importance of understanding that intersection and around racial identity and structural racism in the region. And so I'm really particularly thrilled to bring my friend and colleague, Zakiya Carr-Johnson, to the stage as a facilitator to share her expertise. Zakiya is the founder of Odara Solutions and has launched the Black Women's Disrupt Initiative. She's also served as Senior Advisor of the Race, Ethnicity, and Social Inclusion Unit at the U.S. Department of State. She was the co-chair of the White House Interagency Committee on Gender-Based Violence, Monitoring and Evaluation, and a Senior Technical Advisor for the Social Inclusion Trust Fund at the Inter-American Bank. So you all are in great hands, and I'm happy to turn it over to you now, Zakiya. Thank you for leading us in this discussion today.
Thank you so much, Lorelei, and thank you everyone at Comic Relief US and the Red Nose Day campaign for all of the support. This is the type of conversation we need to be having now. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's get to it. In the United States, nearly 1 in 4 Black, Indigenous, or children of color lives in poverty. And they are 2.5 times more likely to be impoverished than white children. Black, Latinx, Native American children in the US continue to face higher rates of parental unemployment and significantly lower household net wealth relative to white children. This poses barriers to equal opportunities and services that optimize vocational and health outcomes. In Latin America, I'm going to ask someone to mute. I think if we can all mute, it'll be, thank you. In Latin America, 64% of African descendant children complete primary school compared to 80% of non-African descendants. And this group is even less likely to complete secondary education. Across Latin America, young people of African descent, indigenous youth, are most likely to face poverty, illness, limited access to education, unemployment, lower social mobility, and other forms of systemic discrimination. The COVID-19 pandemic has illuminated these disparities with devastating repercussions for education, health, and safety of Black and Brown children across the Americas. This summer, millions of people around the world were moved to action by the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the US, but there were also other instances of violence happening throughout this region, which raised our collective consciousness around the need for racial equity and justice. This movement is global and it has grown. And much remains to be done to address the root causes of the unrest. For few mainstream conversations explore the parallels for African descendant and/or indigenous youth in the Americas as a whole. It's very rare that we have these types of conversations that are transnational in nature about these concepts. We've invited today, or actually our goal today in this plenary is to create a space where we can have dialogue and shared learning, where through our thought leaders, and we've invited 4 amazing thought leaders representing multiple countries and regions today, and multiple communities with different perspectives, to share their reflections and recommendations about the existing challenges and how we as a community can support youth-facing systems of racism and economic inequality, not only in the United States, but also in Latin America. That is our task today. At the intersections of race and poverty, we hope to touch on ways that the communities can show resistance and resilience, the ways that they're using innovation and creativity to address these issues, learning about important models for the field to follow, replicate, and fund. Without further ado, I must introduce this fantastic panel of guests, fantastic panel of leaders. You will note that their experiences are vast. My introduction today is literally just a sample of the wealth of experience and knowledge they bring to this dialogue. Let's get into it. Carla Knapp is a proven visionary and strategic leader with 20 years of executive level nonprofit experience. She currently serves as the National Vice President of Native Services at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, managing the organization's entire network of clubs serving youth in Indian country across the United States. Carla is a tribal member of the Escobar, I might pronounce that wrong, I hope I did not, Indian Nation and Bear Clan. And her mission is to provide opportunities that improve the lives of youth and communities. We also have, welcome Carla. We also have Carolina Escobar Sarti, who is a Guatemalan writer, columnist, social researcher, university professor, and currently National Director of Asociación La Alianza, an organization that works with girls and adolescents at social risk, victims of sexual violence, trafficking in persons, or situations of migration. She's been recognized by Forbes magazine to be among the 100 most powerful women in Latin and Central America. Bienvenida, Carolina. Thank you for joining us. Paula Moreno is a Colombian industrial engineer and graduate in Italian language and culture. As Colombia's former Minister of Culture, she was the youngest to hold the position and the first female Afro-Colombian to hold a presidential cabinet position. She founded Visible Hands in 2010, an organization focused on the empowerment of communities in the margins to change power relations in Colombia and around the world. And in 2018, she published her memoir, The Power of the Invisible: Memories of Solidarity, Humanity, and Resistance. Last but certainly not least, we have Kari Lazare White. Born and raised in New York City, Kari is a social entrepreneur, novelist, educator, activist, and attorney. In 1995, at the age of 21, Kari co-founded the Brotherhood Sister Soul, a now nationally renowned Harlem-based social justice organization. In September of 2017, Seven Stories Press published his first novel, Passage, which is distributed by Penguin Random House. You see, everyone here is a Renaissance leader, super impressed with the different intersections in their backgrounds. They're also leaders in action. So let's go. I'm going to open up the dialogue first, describe a little bit how we're going to manage this panel. We're going to open up the dialogue by asking an opening question to all of our panelists, and we'll follow up with some directed questions for each of them. And then we'll entertain questions from each of you, our colleagues in the audience. And finally, we'll wrap up with our final reflections and hopefully some homework for us all. So I look forward to this conversation. Are we ready, panelists? I know that we're waiting possibly for one more person. Oh, she's here. And we're going to get started. So, based on your experience, what are the most critical issues or needs facing Black and Brown children in the US, or in Guatemala, or in Colombia? Please share your assessment of this context that created or perpetuates the issues which face these young people. I'm going to start with Carla.
Thank you. First, I want to say that I'm so honored to be here. Love Red Nose, have my red nose, but Quay, hello, Woolies fuzz away, good morning to everybody that's joined us today for this amazing discussion and such a needed discussion. So as she mentioned, my name is Carla Knapp. I am a proud tribal member of the Penobscot Bernawebskig tribe, and I am Bear Clan, which we say Owasus. So I do have the honor of leading an amazing team, Boys and Girls Club of America's Native Services. And I lead a team of people that are indigenous and native from across the nation. And so we call ourselves People, Passion, and Purpose. We are truly committed to making a difference for our native youth across the nation. We began our partnership with Red Nose nearly 5 years ago, and started with summer brain gain, working with children in Puerto Rico. But what is near and dear to my heart, 5 years ago, we partnered together to sustain clubs in Indian country and to partner to grow our footprint in Indian country, because I believe every Native community deserves a Boys and Girls Club. And so I am so honored for this partnership. I still remember my first day going to New York and meeting with this amazing group of people. And I found the most compassionate people that care about minorities, indigenous, people of color, Black, just amazing. And, you know, I want to talk a little bit about some of the stats that we're here to talk about. And this is always the hardest part. Sorry, I have some notes, because this is the hardest part for me, because I like to look using a strength-based approach and always talk about the hope and opportunity. I believe as a child, it's really hard to hear that you're a statistic. And so I like to talk about their opportunities and the strengths that are within them. But really, in reality, is that American Indian and Alaskan Native make up less than 2% of the population. And Native people have always been referenced as the invisible people. We have a higher poverty and an unemployment rate when compared with the national average. 43% of Native youth under the age of 5 are living in poverty, while 1 in 6 children in the US live in poverty. Children and teens are at a greater risk for poor academic achievement. school dropout, abuse, neglect, behavioral and social problems, physical health problems, and developmental delays. And the chronic stress that's associated with living in poverty has been shown to adversely affect children's concentration and memory, which impacts their ability to learn. And the list goes on around emotional problems, including depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. When you think of what the COVID-19 pandemic has brought on with the social distancing and the isolation, this is impacting our youth today. When we think about the hunger and the distance to get to a grocery store. Before COVID-19, when we thought of those cycles of poverty, we thought of plumbing poverty, we thought of lack of water. These are things that they thought of, water, sewer, electricity. But now with the onset of COVID-19, I think of broadband as a part of poverty, because without access to broadband, our children will not graduate on time or have the academic success that they deserve to grow up and thrive in this country. So to me, that is a cycle of poverty in this space. And I'm going to end with something the way that I talk about with hope and opportunity. What I do know is that culture saves lives. And I think it's a protective factor. So when I think of the intersections of poverty and racial disparities, as Native people, we are rich in family, we are rich in culture, and that is the thread of our being. So thank you.
Goodness, I'm taking notes, Carla. Fantastic. Why don't we take a trip to Guatemala for a second, and let's find out from Carolina where we stand.
Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this, to be part of this fantastic panel. Wonderful people, thank you. And let me start with a story that was recently in our newspapers. It was 11 in the morning and Miguel hadn't had breakfast yet. His hands, stained with paste and shoe polishing, were squeezing the bread and sausage that he had just been given. I am 9 years old and I am from Momostenango. I live with my brothers and sisters in a room in La Terminal Marketplace, and I start working at 6 in the morning because I take advantage of the fact that people go to work and ask me to polish their shoes, says the boy who shows from walking in the sun. Next to him is Rose, a 13-year-old girl from the same place who accompanies him on the journey until he arrives back at La Terminal at around 7 p.m. Both comment that they migrated to the city with their parents because the family does not have a job and they need an income. Miguel says that he helps with $200, which is more or less $25 a month, to pay for the room in which he lives with the family. The situation of Miguel and Rosa is a reflection of the reality of a good percentage of Guatemalan children who are not in the official statistic on child labor. They are invisible to the state. This was the whole note of this newspaper. The challenges faced by girls and boys from indigenous populations in Guatemala are diverse. Very recently, for example, we said that indigenous girls experience triple discrimination, one for being a woman, another for being indigenous, and another for being poor. Today, we talk about intersectional discrimination, which allows us to better understand and respond to how their Mayan identity intersects with other factors such as rurality, age, poverty, sexual diversity, historical marginalization of indigenous populations in Guatemala and across the continent, and how these crossings contribute to further exclusion. The National Survey of Employment and Income, NA 2018, estimated that almost 400,000 boys and adolescents between 7 and 14 years of age were working, out of which 59% of this population was indigenous. If you would like to see more of this, you can see the British report published in Europe called The Truth Behind Your Coffee. In 2019, working children were not included in DNA, and the previous government did not even give an explanation as to why they were not included in said report. According to official figures, we have more than 70% of the population living in poverty or extreme poverty. However, we are the country with the highest fertility rate in Latin America. On the other hand, 1 of every 2 girls and boys under 5 years of age in Guatemala suffers from irreversible chronic malnutrition, and acute malnutrition has increased during this pandemic to the shameful figure of 21,000 girls and boys. The majority women and indigenous. So we know now that the maps of the greatest poverty, exclusion, and violence are mainly crossed in the regions with the largest indigenous population in the country, which coincidentally were also the most affected populations during our 36-year war. According to the Observatory of Sexual and Reproductive Health, during 2019, more than 94,000 girls and adolescents between 10 and 18 years old were pregnant, 1 every 13 minutes. 89% of them were abused by men from their close environments. And of this 89%, 30% were the biological parents themselves. Most of them in the rural areas far from schools and health centers, or in the peripheral urban areas where there is great poverty and a lot of violence. Many times, their mothers, aunts, and grandmothers lived the same at some point of their lives. This is the reason why I always say that we can speak of an intergenerational normalization of sexual violence in the bodies of girls and adolescents in Guatemala. What country stands on generations of abused bodies of girls and adolescents? Educational coverage also speaks from these figures. Only 75 out of every 100 girls and boys attend elementary school. 4 out of 10 can study in middle school. 2 out of 10 can study in high school. Today, we have more than 2 million girls, boys, adolescents, and young people outside the formal education system, which, said by the former Minister of Education, is a time bomb. During the pandemic, when studying remotely, how many students have electricity, computers, or know about technology in the most remote rural regions of our country? How many of them can study in their languages?
Carolina, you have 5.
Finally, it is estimated that there are some 15,000 gang members in Guatemala, most of them young people. If we add all these factors in a society where 70% of the population are under 29 years old, see that we are not doing things well.
Carolina, I appreciate that broad view, definitely bringing some new insight to us about the overlaying violence, history, as well as the current situations that we're facing and those populations that are most vulnerable in that intersection. Thank you again. I believe we're going to have some connection issues, but we're going to reconnect because technology will not end our day. My colleague Ethan has Paula Moreno on the line, and I'd like to ask her the next question, or the same question. Based on your experience, Paula, what are the most critical issues or needs facing Black and Brown children in Colombia? Please share your assessment in the context that has created or perpetuates these challenges and these issues.
Yes, Akilla, thank you.
Hello, thank you. I can hear you. Can everyone else hear? I hope so. Yes. All right. Technology is not going to stop us, Paula.
Yeah, it will never, it never did, so it will never do. Absolutely. So I'm so happy to be in this panel. Thank you very much to Common Relief US and all the colleagues. And thank you very much, Zakia Carr-Johnson, that has been a great companion in the racial equality task and promotes so many processes and leaders like me. So I'm so happy to be here, and I just would like to summarize my reflection on 3 points. The first one is I deeply, and I have been since I received this beautiful invitation, reflecting, and I deeply believe that we haven't put children and really situate children issues in the court of our racial equality agenda. And I will start by saying that because I think in all agendas, leadership priorities are critical. And in many of the racial movements, in particular in my case, that has been 15 years working in racial equality from government, NGOs, and everywhere, I think that in many of the agendas, I have always encountered that never children are in the center of our agendas. And maybe we need to recall how women issues has been pushed to be in the center of the racial agenda, and now we have a very dynamic and proactive network. But in the case of children, it's not in the same level of priority. And I think we need to have this deep conversation about what is the childhood that we need? How can we see this as an opportunity and possibility? What is the leadership of children in shaping our society, and how we are incubating this systemic change that work for children? And I think I run an organization, and I was thinking we need to copy many of the things that we did in women issues, in other issues, to really put and create an agenda, also taking into account, and then I come to my second point, what is the cause, what is the impact? It's not just because children are cute, beautiful, and we love them, but we need them if we really want to change the future. I mean, it's not just because they are cute, of course, I love children, but it's because we need them. And if we don't incubate very early on a new generation, then we will keep living these cycles that repeat itself every 1, 2, 3 decades. Then my second point is inequality. I think that we need to talk about inequality and children and what kind of inequalities are we facing. Of course, one of the obvious ones, and this with COVID-19, is educational inequality that would increase for Black, Brown, indigenous kids that in their majority, they don't have computers connectivity and their parents lost their job. And this educational inequality that already was very severe compared to the national standards will increase in the following years. And we need to respond in a very urgent way, because otherwise, how can we have positions of representation and power in 1 decade, 2 decades, if even now we are deepening down the quality of our education for children? And economic inequality is another. Just I will mention this too, because of course we know children work, informal work for children, and a whole thing from illegal and legal networks that is very complicated, given the lack of resources of their parents and so on. And my third point, I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time, but the third and final point that I will mention, it's violence and trauma. Because, of course, and disconnect with the second point, half of our children, for instance, aquí in the Colombian Pacific Coast, that is 90% Black, are not at school. Where are they? They are in illegal mining, they are in illegal networks, and so on. And with the pandemics, forced recruitment is increased from illegal networks. So I think we need to talk about violence, and some of my colleagues previously mentioned something. In Colombia, for instance, there is a figure that was published 2 weeks ago about the 50% increase in sexual abuse cases in Colombia in general. You know, And even, of course, we know the problem with dysfunctional families and all these gangs, drug, illegal networks that come first to our children. And that's very sad because they come very early. They move children from this educational system, and they are quicker than us. They go really fast in attracting and capturing lives from our Black and brown children and indigenous children. And in the case of Colombia, with the conflict, we have seen in this region a majority of Black indigenous children in all guerrilla groups and drug trafficking, areas. So I would like just to mention these three. I'm sorry if I took too much time, but I just wanted to just summarize in these 3 points.
Right on time, Paula. Thank you so much. I'd like to shoot it over to Harlem. Let's hear what's happening, Kari, from your perspective.
Sure. First, just thank you so much for the invitation, from Comic Relief and Red Nose. I really appreciate it. From my longtime colleague, Lorelei, just appreciate participating in this conversation. This is a massive undertaking, this issue of the intersection of race and poverty. And of course, that means gender as well, and that all need to be named. I think this is a conversation also that's very interesting to me because of the international aspect of this conversation, the fact that we're talking about the reality of race and poverty and gender from Guatemala to Colombia, First Nation, indigenous land to Harlem, means, I think, a tremendous amount in terms of depth of how we talk about these issues. And so, I first think about kind of the macro when you're asking me about what is it that young people face with regards to race and poverty. What are the critical issues? Obviously, education. From a Harlem perspective, from a United States perspective, the poor education offered in this city, this state, this country for our young people, the fact that there is no right to education embedded in the Constitution of this nation speaks to the lack of priority. The fact that you have political discourse around this conversation so infrequently focuses on education, I think, speaks to the lack of focus on what is most critical to young people, of the development of their minds and their spirits and what we should be doing in schools. Obviously, the issue of poverty, and that poverty is really an issue of violence. I think that it has to be looked at as a public health crisis and also an issue of violence. That, when you talk about what are your realities when you grow up in economic poverty, and I always say, economic poverty, because when you look up the word poor in the dictionary, it says deficient, lacking in worth, lacking in value. And of course, people who are economically poor are not deficient or lacking in worth. We live in a capitalist society that so often elevates, worth to be connected to income and to money, which is completely immaterial in reality to one's wealth. And so we force young people to grow up in substandard housing, to attend substandard schools, to receive substandard health. I work and live in Central Harlem. The life expectancy rate in Central Harlem is 70 years. The life expectancy rate a mile away on the Upper East Side is 91 years. That's violence. 21 years of your life being taken from communities is violence. So I think we have to talk about education. We have to talk about poverty. We have to talk about the scourge of racism. You can't, again, talk about the intersection of race and poverty in this country without talking about, the two original sins of this country, that it's a country founded on the stealing of land from indigenous native peoples. And it's a country whose entire wealth was built on the backs of the enslavement of Black people in this country. You have no economic wealth in this country without the taking of land and the importing of humans. If we talk about race and poverty, you must talk about those two realities that are continually felt today. So I think we have to name racism. I think we have to talk about it. I think we have to talk about the continued systemic inequalities, systemic racism, systemic effects of all of that people face today. The other area I would mention in terms of young people we work with has to do with immigration and immigration status, and the fact that you have, somewhere between 12 and 15 million people in this country who are, quote, undocumented. I would note that many of those people were on this land far before the United States was formed. And so, you know, the border crossed them, they didn't cross the border. You have lots of people who are coming here from South and Central America who have just as much of a right to this land as others who have come here much more recently. But what do you do with such a large undocumented population? For our young people who are seeking previously sought DACA status and sought to be protected in this country, the last 4 years have been 4 years of absolute terror. So I think we have to talk about education and poverty, and broadly what poverty looks like, the economic realities, the labor realities. We have to talk about racism. We have to talk about immigration status. In my remaining, moments of opening comments, I would just then take it to the much more micro and the realities here in New York City. So if we look at it from a national and international perspective, what's happening here in New York? 1/3 of all New Yorkers live in poverty or near the poverty line. You're talking about 3 million New Yorkers, disproportionately Black and Latinx. 10% of the public school students in DOE, by far the largest public school system in America, twice the size of LA's public school system. So you have 1.1 million children. 10% of those children are homeless. Every time I say that statistic, I just think we have to pause for a second, that we as a society, as a country, as a city, in this city allow 10% of our children, over 100,000 children, to be homeless in the wealthiest nation, in the wealthiest city in this country. It's just an abomination that we allow that to continue. It's a violence perpetrated on young people every single day. And so in reality to that, the broad poverty, the broad inequality that our young people face, at the Brotherhood Sister Soul, we provide comprehensive youth development, the development of moral and ethical codes, what it means to be women and leaders and men and brothers and leaders in their community. It's international study in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We're helping young people to become social change agents and social change makers. We train educators on our model across the country and internationally as well. And we work on the foundational issues that our young people face so that they don't have to face that kind of inequality every single day of their lives.
Thank you, Carla.
I think that's the kind of framing of how I come to the work and how I look at these issues.
I apologize in advance for the interruptions I will make, but I will make them because we want to stay on course, everyone. And we know that we've got to get to the questions from our colleagues in the audience as well. Fantastic overview, everyone. Thank you so much. Now let's dig in a little bit further. We've talked about some of the challenges and we've identified those spaces where actually I've seen some common threads. We've talked about the threads of education and access to education, the leadership of children and children being a part of that leadership structure, triple discrimination, multiple forms of discrimination. And then I love what Carla said about culture saving lives. In that vein, Carla also mentioned, let's look toward the solutions or look away from some of the deficit conversation and talk about what makes us strong. So my next question will be to Carla and Paula. What specific supports do youth from historically marginalized communities need to be prepared for the future? What do they need from your perspective? Let's start with Carla and then follow with Paula.
Well, first I wanted to say, Sarah, your voice is so powerful that you have inspired me to be a bigger voice. And you said things that I have a hard time saying. And so I just want to say thank you. When I think of the historical trauma and we'll get into that, but what a youth need. I think they need to be heard. I think we need to listen and lean in more and hear what they need. I think that is the biggest thing. When I think about how their normal routines have really fallen apart around them during the COVID-19 pandemic and, with racial injustice, and right now uncertainty is really thriving, not just with youth, but within adults in our community. And so I think when we can actively engage them, so I always think about, meeting their most urgent needs. What do our youth need? What does our staff need, even those that are working with youth? And then how do we take care of ourselves so that we can better take care of each other? I'm not sure if that gets to the entire question, but I would like opportunity for others to speak. But really, it's about leaning in, listening to their needs, meeting their most urgent needs, but not just for them, for their caretakers too, because you need to treat people and communities holistically.
Thank you, Carla. Paula?
Yes, and then Sakia from Solutions, I think I will just mention two. The first one is I really think that we need to define the leadership that we need for moving this agenda of children in governments, in universities, in different spaces. I mean, who will be open the spaces, because we need the scale and we need as system change. So in the case, for instance, of Visible Hands, we now have two leaders in the National Institute for Childhood in Colombia. What are they doing? How they will have an agenda? How can they influence from there? And I think we need to think about these insiders, outsiders, who have the budgets, who also determines, for instance, in the Ministry of Education, in the case of Colombia, or in the Instituto Bienestar Familiar. I mean, we need to really map that and say we need these 20 people moving this agenda in the Ministry of Finance, in the Ministry of Education, and that to really make something not just goodwill, but really strategic, and that we can measure our impact in the major office, or, like really how we train these people, how we set an agenda and put in place a system that really we try. So that's one point. The second point, and I would just echo Carla, what she said about the cultural sector and the power of culture. And I think we need to create a space in terms of narrative and imagination for our children. And just give you one example. I have a conversation 4 months ago with Penguin Random House here in Colombia. And I was telling to Penguin Random House, I want child literatures, books and they were saying, like, Paula, we don't have any image of Black kids or indigenous kids in our child books. And I was like, what does it mean for us? So I really feel that in the cultural sector, we really need to move an agenda to create a space in the imaginary and self-esteem and development of our children. In music, because who sings for children? In literature, because they are not reading and they are not seeing any narrative for them. In audiovisual, because in the TV, we don't see anything that, we really need to also influence, but not just for Black and brown or indigenous children, but for the rest of society. That is part of the crisis that we are seeing now, that we're facing now. To see natural in a child book that there are Black people, white people, indigenous people, but in the same book and in the same narrative. That is our main goal. I stop there.
Paula's gonna make me cry today because I just had this conversation with my children about illustrations and the representation of who we are in the books that we read and the things that we watch, and not seeing ourselves. Beautiful, beautiful commentary. I'm going to ask Kari and Carolina a different question. How are we as a society, and we're multiple societies in this conversation, but how are we missing the opportunities to engage youth? And are there places or examples, ways that we are showing up best for our populations, for our children in these populations? Sorry. Yes, Carolina,
okay.
Please start.
Okay. And so as a society, we are missing the opportunity to put them at the center of our development model and agenda. So we need the state and the society very compromised with them in the whole diversity that we are. And I have here a phrase, a statement: never again without them. because childhood and youth are not the future, but the present of our countries. And I remember that a quote of Gabriela Mistral, who said, today, so we cannot wait any longer. Getting them involved in their lives and transforming them goes through something as simple as listening to them, believing them, and acting accordingly. That would be not failing them. It is necessary for us to build their life plan with them, their present and future perspectives, as well as give them the tools and the spaces to develop or move forward. We have seen in Alianza with the young women who arrive completely broken or have been rescued from places where they have been treated or trafficked, how things as simple as listening to them without judging them helps. How to allow them to speak their language and wear their traditional clothing when they ask to do so helps too much. How to respect them without deciding for them helps. Offering opportunities for education, sports, art, theater, creation helps also. How to offer them mental and physical health helps a lot. How being accompanied in the tortuous and complicated legal processes by means of a strategic litigations helps. How loving them and offering them a safe place helps. How working the transition to an autonomous and financially independent, that gives them a lot of strength and makes experience a transformative one. So if you see that Guatemala's children, adolescents, and youth who live in unworthy conditions are not in the center of our development model and our political agendas, this will not work. This means that the state and the society of our countries must acknowledge its historical depth with them, especially with the Mayan, Garifunas, Xinkas, and Creole or Afro-descendant populations that represent almost half of our population. It is 44% of our population that is indigenous. So we have indigenous or Afro-descendant. So we have to be, we have the center of everything. And because they are today, we cannot wait for them to grow and to the next generation to do what we didn't do. So we have to start now, everywhere we are.
Carolina, fantastic. I think in the beginning, we did not mention the populations of these populations within the countries that we live. But Colombia has a population of 23, if I'm not mistaken, 23% African descendant, 10% indigenous. Guatemala has a population, you just mentioned, Carolina, of combined African descendant and indigenous peoples, 44%. These are majority population, or larger populations than we are used to understanding about how Latin America works. We often don't get to hear those stories. So we appreciate that, Carolina, for sharing. And
thank you.
Of course. Let's move on to our next question, if you will. Or wait, no, we have Kari. I'm sorry. Same question. How are we missing opportunities? What can we be doing? And what are some examples of ways that we are showing up for our youth?
Well, first, I would echo what Carolina said. I think it's so essential that we position our young people front and center and create spaces for them to be central to the conversation. And number two, that we also get out of the way. They don't just need spaces created. They also at times need us to get out of the way, and they will claim their own space. And as a youth leadership, youth development organization, that's been central to the work that we do. I mean, I think they are the people who best are the advocates for themselves. I mean, when you think about a critical issue like the over-suspension of Black and Latinx girls in the United States and in New York City specifically, we need to hear from girls and young women. We need to hear them articulate what those realities are like, the intersectionality of the oppression they face due to race and due to gender. We need to hear their voices. And so, this is a country that has always, whenever you've seen change in this country, young people have been at the forefront of that change. whether you're talking about the efforts to change civil rights in this country, the Black Power movement, the Latinx movement, from the Chicano movement to the farm workers. When you look at leadership of AIM, when you look at the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement, every social justice movement has had young people at the forefront, high school aged, young college age. Freedom riders were 17 and 18 years old. This idea that somehow we have to create space down the road for young people, or that they are not the leaders of today, A, is inappropriate, but B, it's ahistorical. It's just simply not the reality that young people have been centrally involved in social change movements. And so often they're the ones who are the braver voices. They're the ones who reimagine a different type of future. When you think about the movement right now around environmental justice issues and the Green New Deal, so many of the key voices in the environmental justice movement are young people. And I think that we have to understand that, and we have to stop consistently telling young people that their future is coming. And I would echo what Carla and Carolina said. It is right now. It is right here. And we do ourselves a disservice as a society that we do not adhere to and listen and follow those voices. They're centrally involved in any aspect of change.
Kari, that is a salient point here. Absolutely. That the future is now. The future is not some distant place far ahead of us. So now that we've defined some of the challenges, we've identified some ways that we are showing up, or that we can show up. This is it is a forum and a dialogue with multiple stakeholders, correct? But I would like us to aim our next answers at the people who will support this work that we're doing. Because one thing that I love to say is that, presupuestos matter, orzamentos matter, budgets matter. So doing this work in the ether with no resources and support is a difficult and difficult way to carry the work. So in what ways can philanthropic organizations, or any of us here listening to this conversation, provide support for these types of changes and create the opportunities we'd like to see for our communities so that they can lead in this change? It's a bold question, I know, but let's see who will start. Paula, we'll go backwards. Paula, please start for us.
Yeah, no, for instance, I really think, Sakija, that we need, of course, to influence government budgets that are very big in general in Latin America for children. But how effective are these budgets? How well distributed are these budgets and everything? Can you hear me? Yes?
Yep.
Okay. So I think governments keep being one of the aspects, but I agree with you that we need to see other players in this system. And I deeply believe in corporations. I don't know, but in particular, I don't know if you have analyzed these trends that Oxfam just published in terms of the growing billionaires, the people who are becoming wealthier during the pandemics. And we have many enterprises that have an influence on children, like Amazon and other corporations, that can do more. And I deeply believe that we need to integrate some of these corporations into the conversations, reduce educational inequality, to reduce other kind of inequalities that in terms affect the system. So I would really target, because I think philanthropy, and given the trends that we have with COVID-19, is a force to promote others to do things, but won't be the main source of resources for change, for system change. I think that philanthropy needs to be very strategic in pushing those billionaires and bigger corporations that are growing in this pandemic, calling their social responsibility, and at the same time, trying to influence that government investment and the reduction of corruption in this investment go to the agenda as well.
Thank you. Let's see, Kari.
I would make 3 points. I mean, I think first, from a U.S. context, I am not very hopeful of the role of large corporations in transformational change. I mean, less than 5% of all philanthropic dollars provided for nonprofits and for social change efforts come from corporations. Historically, doesn't mean you don't have individual corporations that have stepped up, but historically, corporations have not played a substantial role in this kind of work. I think the second point I would make to kind of philanthropy and funding is that it's absolutely, I think, essential that the investment of resources and dollars matches the narrative. I think all too often we hear a narrative about, wanting transformational change, or wanting to end poverty, or wanting to, deal with the environmental crisis we're facing, but the dollars don't match that. And that becomes a very difficult and dangerous conversation. If there's a national effort to support girls and young women, or a national effort to support boys and young men, and the dollars and resources aren't there to respond to the totality of the problem, then when that unsuccessful, the narrative will be, see, you can't help these girls and young women. You can't help these low-income people. You can't help these folks. But the reality is that the resources were really not, put in place. And I would agree with your point, Zakia, around budgets. I think that, budgets are moral documents that tell us what the priority of a funding entity or government is. And when you look at the macro that we're talking about today and these huge issues, it's really only municipal and state and federal government that have the resources to truly respond. Private philanthropy doesn't have the resources to completely respond. They can be a pace setter, they can be at the forefront, but they can't really respond to the comprehensive issues that we're facing. And the third point I would make is that I think when philanthropy commits, they must commit long-term. If you're trying to deal with issues around inequality, around gender and race and economics, you can't have a 2-year funding effort. You can't have a 5-year funding plan. We are talking about responding to generations of structural inequality. And if you want to respond to that, if you really want to be a part of that movement, then, and your role as a funder, then what you have to do is commit the way activists commit long-term. So if we're committing for decades upon decades upon decades, and you want to be a part of that effort, then your funding needs to commit equally long-term.
Fantastic. Both of those points. Let's hear from Carla.
Well, I have 3 things, just like Carrie did. One is I think that we need to center voices, right? Where centering voices are part of the decisions that impact them. I think their voice is so important, including in the charitable response. But I wrote down a couple things because as I was listening, when I think of the indigenous population and Native people in the United States, they have been overly surveyed. And then it would just be amazing that, the funder would understand the research and evaluation on a sovereign nation is not the proper thing to do. They are a sovereign nation. And so if funders would understand, what is the need of the community? How does it meet their most urgent needs? And then what are the metrics or data needed for the funding? That to me seems to be a challenge in philanthropy. The other thing is we talked about that culture saves lives. It is a huge protective factor, but yet we don't have culturally evidence-based programs that can really make a big impact. So how can, whether it's the federal government or whether it is another funder in philanthropy, allowing culture to be part of the solution so that, children can thrive, because we know culture saves lives.
Thank you so much, Carla. Carolina, you're going to bring us home on this one.
Yes. I want to make a mix here of many issues. First, I want to remember that in our countries, like in Guatemala, for example, the investment in children continues to be very low. And in our case, is the lowest in Latin America, as I told you before. So with that in mind, we need some help to do our programs, because the state, we are doing what the state should do, and they don't do that. They don't have the right programs, as Carla said. But we, in our case, philanthropic organizations can do a lot of good, but we need to have a dialogue. We need to have conversations because we have a strategic view, a strategic plan. We work on this comprehensive manner, and we know exactly because we work in the communities with the people in the land, and we work with them. So we are very close to the problems and the needs, and we want also them to be part of everything. We need to put them in the center of everything. So we are part of, as we are part of Covenant House, an organization that is in 6 countries and that believes in inclusion. And we have like some philanthropic organizations, but we work country by country. And in my case, I talk to each part, to each counterpart, or to each organization that is helping us, because they need to know what they are doing and exactly where are they putting their money. And supporting La Alianza in Guatemala, for example, for us does not just mean providing money. It's a lot much more. They give thousands of girls, boys, and adolescents the opportunity to have an education that they never had before because we have a school inside. They give also the opportunity of having medical or psychological care that they could never afford. We support also the families with a special school that we have here, and the social workers work with them in a great way twice a month, since many of these family members are illiterate. And so we can have here, they can play musical instruments, they learn here to paint, to act, to write, to play soccer or do marathons, something that as a working child or adolescent or trafficked child, or poor child, it is not possible here in Guatemala. So here, even the lawyers that accompany them to their legal processes and empowers them are paid by these organizations that are not giving only money. They are helping us to transform lives. Okay. and to make representations to the national or local governments so that the state or affairs changes. So when I go to every state minister, I remember that somebody is paying for this part or this part of our work. But before of that, we were like doing a very strong compromise with all the organizations that are giving us money.
Carolina, we have to transition. Thank you so much. I appreciate each and every one of you for answering these, just the questions that help us set the stage. And we have a tremendous amount of audience participation, so we want to get to that as soon as possible. Wonderful comments all around. So Carla made a mention about how culture saves lives, but how do we start moving the needle culturally to move from culture saving lives to allowing children to thrive? This is a question from Gunnar Hagstrom. And let's let Laurie, from Laurie, okay. In real time, the questions are popping up on the screen. So Carla, if you can answer that question, if you will. And you have 2 minutes.
So the question is that how do we let youth, say that one more time, with their culture?
The question is, how can we start moving the needle from culture saving lives to allowing children to thrive? So going beyond survival to actually benefiting, and maybe answer it how you see fit, because it could be interpreted several different ways.
Yeah, there's different ways I'm thinking about it. So, one, I think of the culture, right? Whether it is thriving in this era, to make sure there's culturally relevant resources, culturally relevant tools, culturally relevant programs, and whether it's even technical assistance. But thriving too is like an acknowledgement that we are indigenous people, and that sense of pride, that sense of belonging of where you come from, that's also part of your culture. I wrote something down that I always think about and where did I put it? But I was always taught that when we know the stories of our family, we build resilience and give our children and teens both a strong identity and sense that they belong to something greater than themselves. And so just knowing who you are, where you come from, it can build resiliency and change your life. And I don't know if I've answered their question, but it's a very powerful question around culture.
Yeah, I think you made some inroads on that. I mean, it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, but at least you addressed it, and we can continue to have this conversation because it is a dialogue. So there's a question for all of the panelists. Thank you, Carla. Given the complexities of the many variables that keep children in poverty and how intersectional identities experience different levels of discrimination or higher levels of discrimination than others, what is the one thing that needs most investment? Like if you could identify one thing, is it safety? Is it health? Is it education? Where would you focus? I believe that's what they were trying to say. Let's start with Paula.
Yes, I think there's no one single investment. I would say that you need to have multi-pronged approaches to really create a systemic change, because it's not just education, it's safety, it's a mix. It's not just one thing. And I also believe that in order to build change, you need to diversify your entry points, because otherwise you just center one thing and then you are not dealing with the others. And then I think you need to diversify your entry points. As Carla mentioned, and I just wanted to comment on her perspective, I think, for instance, now with this pandemic, cultural groups are really in a crisis, but cultural groups can affect the educational system. Now that, cultural groups in neighborhoods are those who are helping to reduce the educational inequality. So I think that also you need to diversify the actors, because sometimes the entry points can be a cultural group that is in the neighborhood. It's not just the school, but you need to work with the school, but at the same time with the cultural groups. Just to give an example, or the women network, or this and that. Stop there, sorry.
Often we think that there's only one particular entry point, and I like understanding that it is multifaceted. It is very difficult when these issues are interconnected to say, oh, if we stop violence, then poverty will end. If we stop this, then that will end. We do have to have some multiple solutions. So thank you again for your answer, Paula. Did anyone else want to answer this one? Burning response? Carolina?
I want to say, yeah, I just want to say, I want to go back to this statement that we need to put them in the center of our development models and never again with them. But I agree also with Paula that there are many things that need to be done in this holistic way of seeing, of doing things for a systemic change. So we need to promote, for example, better legislative agendas, including and inclusive agendas. We need to ensure that the national budget works with a focus on childhood and adolescence, especially in favor of indigenous children and Afro-descendant girls and boys. We need to review the current public policies and translate it into protection and prevention programs, and we need the participation of them everywhere. So I also believe that this is not only a one thing answer, but we need to, if we put them in the center of our development models, then you can go to many places at the same time.
We answered a question. It's okay. Let's shift to another question, because there are several on the list. Panelists, how do we create an agenda to address the issues that you've all raised during the panel? How can Comic Relief support us all to move this agenda? What is an advocacy or policy agenda? And this is from Cynthia Jackson from Educare. And building on that question, someone asked, as institutions, what could we do together to further efforts or policies at the local, national, or global levels to lift up the issue of race and poverty for children? So I'm going to ask Kari to start this round of question answering.
I think that this question connects to the previous question in certain ways, and I share and echo my fellow panelists' perspective that there is no one intervention. I mean, you're asking about the response to poverty and to racism in this country and internationally. I think that can feel insurmountable. That can feel so intimidating and massive that what can one do? So first, I think we all just have to get to work. We have to do our work. We have, with whatever role we play in that, we have to do our work on a local level, on a micro level, on a soul program level. We have to do it in whatever way we can to help people, to support people, and to support and continue to build a more beloved community. So I think we have to do that. But I think at the same time, parallel to that, not in response to that, not different than that, but parallel to that, we also have to have the big conversation. I mean, let's just talk about one child here in New York. We're talking about racism and poverty. If that child is growing up in economic poverty and growing up in substandard housing with insufficient heat and mold on the walls and lead in the walls, and then that child has insufficient food for his or her belly in the morning before they're supposed to be going to school, or they're homeless, as I talked about already, before they step into school, then how are they supposed to focus on school? Then they attend school, and invariably they're attending a substandard school that the highest court in the state of New York has found disproportionately provides a 9th grade level education for a 12th grade diploma. So now the fourth issue that they're facing is substandard schooling. They may face violence in their community and trauma from it. They may face intergenerational poverty and the results from it. So if somebody says, what's the one thing for that 8-year-old girl in central Brooklyn and South Bronx and central Harlem, there is no one thing. It's what are we doing to create a web of support, a web of community, and a web of response, because the negative forces that 8-year-old is facing are comprehensive in nature. And so our response cannot be singular in nature. It has to be comprehensive. And so we have to talk about housing and education and poverty and schooling and all of these issues, because that's the only real way that you can create a space for all of these children to have an opportunity and a chance. And I don't think we should shy away from naming that and articulating that, while at the same time, sometimes doing much more localized work. We have to do both at the same time.
Sir, thank you. Is there anyone else that wants to answer that one? I would like us to shift to the one about how can Comic Relief support us all to move this agenda and further our efforts or policies at the local, national, and global levels to lift up the issues of race and poverty for our children. So perhaps this person is asking the question of, what do we do next? How do we work together? Is there a way to work together? And if you all are interested in answering that one, answer now.
May I?
Yes, Carla.
I was writing some notes down, but, right now, our Black communities are suffering. They need to hear the words that Black lives matter. That's more important than ever. But when we think of Black, Indigenous, and our communities of color, they're counting on us to show up. They're experiencing trauma that can't go unacknowledged. So we're all being called to show up, be brave, have courageous conversations, especially in this moment. So how can we move disparities to equity so that everyone can thrive and live their best lives? I know I've said that before, but when I think of the historical trauma and we think about what our ancestors endured, our own personal trauma, what COVID-19 has brought, what racial injustice has brought, just keeps ripping open those wounds. And so when I think of how can we work together to make a difference, and I heard, there's lots of things that we need to focus on, but how do we focus on being trauma-informed and using those guiding principles as the lens of how we serve youth through an organization? We need to get to the root of trauma and start building resiliency in our youth together so that they can thrive.
Thank you, Carla. Does anyone else want to take that one on? Paula?
Yes, I would just add to the two questions, the agenda and your last questions. I would say that the agenda is needed to be strategic, to really be strategic and to know what are our priorities, because since we have too much work to be done and everything is, I think it's important to define what are the 5 points that we want to move on in this decade. And I think that for building that agenda, it's important to have deep conversations, but in terms of who really cares about it, because otherwise you build an agenda, but you are not asking who really cares, and how do you make the people that we need to care about and to do something, if they don't care, how we make them care, and to be really seen, for instance, in the case of Latin America, many of the people who cares for Black and brown children in Colombia, Brazil are in the US. And our congressmen and all the people are not the Congress in Colombia. So how these become part of our transnational agenda, being very specific in really having 5 points that we can measure, and then we are very specific for those people who have been working on racial equality for decades to be useful, but we really need to have the 5, critical points just to move the agenda forward. And I think that requires knowledge base and reflection to be specific about budgets, about dimensions, about strategies in the national context, and advocacy. I would say that.
I knew I could count on each one of you to be absolutely strategic in your answers. I love how you have shown up in this panel. I think we have time for one last question, hopefully, for all of you to answer. Alexis Ramon says, all of these stories are so powerful. I'm wondering how we determine development across all these countries, and whether the intersectionality of these topics varies from country to country as percentage of race varies. So maybe this is a question, I don't know. Let's see if we can try to answer this question for Alexis. Who wants to start? Let's see. We began with the conversation of talking about the percentages in each of the countries where we're working. The US population of people of African descent and Native peoples, can you all share that with us so we can all have the same exact information? Maybe Carla, tell us the population of the percentage of the population of Native peoples.
Yeah, so in the United States, it's less than 2% of the population in the United States.
Ari, in the US, if you have statistics on African descendants?
It's about 12%. Some of it depends on other populations, because of the census. So like the Afro-Latinx population, et cetera, but it's approximately 12%.
Yeah. And we mentioned earlier that in Colombia, it's 23% and around 10% African descendant and indigenous. And in Carolina mentioned that 44% if you combine indigenous peoples and people of African descent, such as Garifuna and others in Guatemala. And I would say in the region, in the Americas, people of African descent are 200 million. That's about a little bit over 1/4, a little bit more than 1/4 of the population of all of the Americas, from Canada to the Patagonia. This is a significant set of populations. That's people of African descent. Indigenous peoples are a little bit smaller population in terms of percentage of the total population. But the intersectionality, I don't think, depends on the actual percentage of people that you have in the country. It is the experience of those people. I don't know if you all agree with me. It's not particularly weighted on what is the large or small number that is in a country. It is the experience that they're living, the situations they are confronting, and the histories that are different from maybe the histories of others, particularly those who are in positions of power in the countries that we live in. Would anyone want to share any other thoughts on that intersectionality and a difference from country to country? Okay. So I don't know, Alexis, he's a youth advisory council member. So one of our young people are showing up and asking really good questions. What we know is that we have to have these conversations to be able to even know what are we talking about and who are we talking about? And if we haven't traveled to certain regions or we don't have direct experience, it's important for us to share what we know. So I appreciate your question, Alexis, and we will continue to have a deeper conversation in this last question. Dulce de Rio Pineda has asked, given that the discrimination against women and girls, particularly the abuse committed toward them, exists, how do we focus on alternatives to provide protection to them and support strengthening their voices and honoring them? I'm going to ask Carolina to take this question, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, that will be.
Okay, thank you. You can do a lot with this, but you have to do many things at the same time, and you have to be you have to work with a very professional and compromised team to work that issues, because when you work with victims, it can be very hard for the people that are working with them also. So you have to take care of the people who take care. You have to take care of yourself. I wanted to start with that, but you are not only working on the protection issues. You need to work on protection, prevention, on access to justice and advocacy. And you have to put in the center of everything the human rights issue, and because so you can cross all the factors that make us do a better analysis of this intersectional discrimination that they have here in Guatemala. For example, we have to work we have to work a lot with this machista culture. It means that we have a society that normalizes this sexual violence against the girls and the boys. And before that, there was a right that was called derecho de pernada. And this right meant in the lands of Guatemala in the 19th and 20th century that the owners of this land or the ones that were in charge of the land could rape the oldest daughters of the people that were working in these farms without questioning them. It was supposed to. So this derecho de pernada was very much in our imaginaries, in our social imaginaries. So we have to deal with that cultural issues, but we have also to deal with the lack of education through generations that we have here. So this means that's why we are not asking only of protection, but we are talking about prevention, access to justice, and advocacy in the state, because we have to work with the whole families. When we have here a girl that has been raped in their environment, of course, the families, the parents cannot come here to us. But if the families were not part of that, we work with these families a lot. So
frozen, unfortunately, but that's okay, because we said technology won't stop us. I'm sure we will find a way to hear from her in the continuation. Right now, though, I'd like each and every one of our panelists, I want to thank you all for taking the time out today to be with us. We know that even though we're on these virtual machines, we all have so much still to do every day. And if you all could take one last chance to remind us what we need to know as we leave this room. One last bit of homework, one last recommendation. I'm going to start with you, Carla, and then Paula, and then Kari, and then Carolina if she comes back.
Okay. No pressure, right? If we have to leave with one sentence. So I'm going to say, as we begin to heal as a nation and globally, as a Native person, it's simply understood as being a good relative, showing up, being present, interacting with one another with the intentions of learning from our past 7 generations and knowing that our actions today will impact the next 7 generations.
Beautiful, thank you. Paula.
My last thought would be about the demographic, how we can also build a narrative of demographic force from our children and our youth in aging societies, because even in the Americas, we have aging societies, to build this opportunity and productive, not just from like the trauma that we have lived, but the opportunity because we will be the workforce, but we want to be a workforce and so many other elements in our society to build change. And we want to dominate this narrative, not to others to create for our future that narrative. So I would just add this last thought.
Thank you, Paula. Kari?
Yeah, for my last thought, I actually would just return to the last question. I think when we're talking about the ways that we need to support girls and young women and respond to the gender-based violence that is rampant and a plague, I think one aspect of what we do at Brother and Sister Soul is the Sister Soul chapters, a space where girls come together with women as elders to go through a rites of passage program and identify a moral and ethical code and what it means to be women and leaders and sisters, and develop a strong sense of self and of their own power. So I think that's one piece. I think the second is that we have to confront this warped concept of masculinity and manhood that's rampant around the world, that breeds violence, that the overwhelming majority, damn near all of the violence perpetrated is perpetrated by men, regardless of border. And what does that say about manhood and masculinity? And what work needs to be done with boys and young men around anti-sexist work and work to redefine manhood and masculinity that will result in a safer world for everybody.
Fantastic. I believe Carolina unfortunately had a difficulty with the connection, but she's with us here in our hearts. I just have a few words of closing, if that's all right. Panelists, are you all right? We did okay? All right. I know we have so much more that we can discuss. There's so much more that this conversation is just the beginning. Here's Carolina. Carolina, your last word. One more word.
Oh, so many words, but I just want to say that childhood is today and that girls have to be in the center of everything, and indigenous girls more than others, because like making the society we want to see in the future and the one.
Much. Thanks again. We are going to be able to show everyone some more of the conversations, and people left such beautiful messages in the chat, but I'm going to wrap this up in one last thought. We did something different today. We explored an entire region with just 4 people. There's so many more voices that can be heard in this conversation, but we had to choose a few. And boy, were we lucky to choose some amazing folks. You guys are really thinking about these issues and really putting your minds and thoughts and experiences toward the solution, the challenges that we face in our communities. Throughout the Americas, from Canada to the Patagonia, legacies of colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and de jure and de facto segregation in employment, housing, and education, as well as pigmentocracy and the intergenerational poverty that we experience, have created a matrix that leaves children, youth, and their families more vulnerable to illness, hunger, trafficking, and other forms of violence and exclusion than others. Our guests today shared some amazing interventions which draw on the resilience and resistance models from our communities, from our experiences, to invest in the future of our children. Kari mentioned the Rites of Passage program. Carla Knapp talked about culture being an important way to survive and live. And Paula talked about seeing and exploring a different narrative that our children can see and be proud of. Carolina talked about protecting the lives of indigenous women and protecting them from violence and harm. So we are tasked, everyone, to walk the talk. If we're truly interested in seeing our children thrive, and I say our children because the children from these communities are all of our children. If we are tasked to walk the talk and we want to see them thrive and live healthy and safe lives, what will we do as a community of practitioners, policymakers, donors, and other stakeholders to address the concerns raised today within the United States and Latin America? Everyone, I leave this up to you. We have the space, we have the resources. Let's find a way to work together to solve some of these challenges and watch our children thrive. Thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate you all.
Thank you, Sakia.
Thank you, Willy Wani.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.